23 individuals perished in Culpeper County, Virginia, between April and September of 1859. All were discovered with fractured necks or crushed windpipes. There were no witnesses and no signs of a struggle. The local sheriff's office classified each death as either an accident or due to natural causes. Despite the uniformity of the injuries, what the official records failed to disclose was that every victim shared a commonality. They all resided within 3 miles of the Rutland plantation. Furthermore, what those records intentionally obscured was that 3 weeks prior to the first fatality, an entity had emerged from a cellar that had remained sealed for 12 years. The Confederate Army's own documents, declassified in 1963, contain a single unsettling line regarding Culpeper County in 1859. Local situation resolved. Witnesses silenced. Recommend no further investigation. Before we proceed with the narrative of what truly transpired at the Rutland plantation, I must pose a question. This account was concealed for over a century, hidden within archives that were never intended to be accessed. If tales like this captivate you, if you wish to learn about more cases that were systematically erased from history, please subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell. Additionally, I am curious, where are you currently listening from? Please share your state or city in the comments. Now, allow me to introduce you to a man named Silas and the 12 years that transformed him into something that continues to haunt Culpeper County to this day. The tale commences not with horror, but with something far more mundane, and perhaps this is what renders it so unsettling. Culpeper County in 1847 was characterized by its undulating hills and tobacco plantations, with the Blue Ridge Mountains serving as silent observers of the daily life on the plantations. The county seat, home to a mere 800 residents, existed in that unique southern state of genteel poverty, where white-columned facades concealed homes with leaky roofs and bare pantries. The Rutland plantation was located 5 miles southwest of the town, a modest establishment by Virginia's standards, employing only 42 enslaved individuals to work on 300 acres of increasingly depleted soil. Colonel Thaddeus Rutledge was a man of specific habits and notable cruelties. At the age of 53, he had never taken a wife, residing alone in the main house, save for the house servants who drifted through the rooms like specters. His neighbors in Culpeper described him as proper and dignified, a man who attended church every Sunday and settled his debts punctually. However, they were oblivious to the way his hands trembled with fury at the slightest provocation, and how his voice could descend to a whisper that was somehow more frightening than any shout. Silas was born on the plantation in 1823, and from the moment of his birth, he was different. His skin lacked pigment, appearing almost translucent in certain lighting. His hair was as white as cotton, and his eyes were a pale gray that seemed to see through people rather than at them. The other enslaved individuals murmured that he was marked, though whether by divine intervention or something else remained uncertain. His mother, Ruth, passed away when he was 7, and from that point onward, Silas largely grew up in solitude, avoided by those who found his appearance disconcerting. However, Silas possessed a unique quality that rendered him indispensable to Rutledge, an almost supernatural talent for handling horses. The most aggressive stallion would settle under his pale hands. Mares that had previously resisted breeding would welcome his presence. By the age of 24, Silas had ascended to the role of head groom on the plantation, a position that afforded him minor privileges, a secluded area in the stable quarters, and occasional excursions to town for the procurement of veterinary supplies. It was during one of these excursions in March of 1847 that Silas committed his error. He had been tasked with retrieving medicine for a horse suffering from colic. This errand led him to the apothecary shop on Main Street, where he met a free black woman named Hannah, who was employed as a seamstress in the adjacent building. She appeared to be around 30, with perceptive eyes and nimble hands that were always in motion. Their conversation lasted no more than 3 minutes while Silas awaited the apothecary's preparation of the medicine. Hannah mentioned that her brother was employed on a farm in Pennsylvania. She informed Silas that the North was different, that men like him could earn wages and own property. Just 3 minutes. That was all it took to sow a seed that would eventually lead to disaster. Silas began to devise a plan. He was cautious, patient, and methodical. He saved leftover food. He studied the patrol routes of the night watch. He took note of which roads led north and which were the most frequented. For 2 months he made preparations, confiding in no one, maintaining a neutral expression whenever Rutledge or the overseer, a thick-necked man named Virgil Pewitt, approached. On the night of May 17, 1847, Silas made his attempt. The moon was obscured, and the spring air was laden with the fragrance of magnolia and impending rain. He slipped away from the stable quarters at 2 a.m., navigating through the shadows he had memorized. He traveled nearly 3 miles following deer trails that meandered through the forest bordering the plantation. His pale skin was concealed beneath stolen dark clothing, with a small bundle of provisions secured to his back. The dogs discovered him at dawn. Whit and 3 other men pursued him as if they were hunting a fox. They dragged him back to the plantation behind a horse, his body bruised by rocks and roots, his stolen garments reduced to rags. When they cast him at Rutledge's feet, Silas did not plead. He remained silent. He merely gazed up at the colonel with his pale gray eyes, and in that instant, an understanding of mutual loathing so profound passed between them that it required no words. The events that followed were witnessed by 7 individuals: Pewitt, the 3 riders, and 3 house servants who were attending to tasks in the main house. Rutledge did not order Silas to be whipped. He did not sell him south, which was the customary punishment for escapees. Instead, the colonel remained silent for an extended moment, his expression becoming very still in a manner that those familiar with him had learned to dread. "Take him to the root cellar," Rutledge instructed quietly. "Lock the door. No one is to enter without my permission." The root cellar was situated beneath the kitchen house, a separate structure that stood 30. The structure was located away from the primary dwelling. It was a typical aspect of plantations, serving as a storage area for vegetables and preserved items in the cool, dark environment beneath the surface. The entrance featured a substantial wooden door, positioned at an angle into the ground, secured with an iron bolt and padlock. Stone steps descended into a chamber measuring approximately 12 feet in length, 8 feet in width, and 7 feet in height at the center, with a curved ceiling that conformed to the arch of the supporting stones. Silas was thrown down those steps at 9 a.m. on May 18, 1847. The final sight he beheld before the door slammed shut was a rectangle of blue sky, and the last sound he heard was the scraping of the bolt sliding into place. The cellar was devoid of windows. During the summer, the temperature remained cool at around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. In winter, it lingered just above freezing. The air was damp, saturated with the scent of earth and stone. A small ventilation grate, no larger than a man's fist, allowed just enough air for breathing, but insufficient to eliminate the persistent moisture that condensed on the walls. For the initial weeks, Silas screamed. He pounded his fists against the door until they bled. He cried out for mercy, for water, for light. The only reply was the daily scraping of the bolt. The door opened just wide enough for a tin plate to be pushed through, containing whatever remnants the kitchen had left. Cornbread soaked in pot liquor, chicken bones with a few morsels of meat, and occasionally just a handful of raw turnips. A wooden bucket functioned as his toilet, emptied every 3 days by whoever drew the short straw among the house servants. By the second week, Silas had ceased his screams. He had started to realize that no one was coming to free him. This was not a temporary punishment. This was something entirely different. The darkness was complete. In that total absence of light, time lost all significance. Silas could not discern whether his eyes were open or shut. He would wave his hand in front of his face and perceive nothing, feel nothing except the movement of air. His albinism, which had always rendered bright sunlight excruciating, was irrelevant here. In this environment, he was no different from anyone else. Equally blind, equally confined. However, Silas possessed something that prevented him from succumbing to immediate insanity. Routine. He had devoted his entire life to a strict routine. The routine of enslaved labor, where each day adhered to the same pattern from before dawn until after dark. Now in the cellar, he established a new routine. He began to move. Initially, it was merely to maintain warmth, to combat the damp cold that infiltrated his bones. He paced the perimeter of the cellar 12T8 FT 12T8 FT, counting his steps, one hand trailing along the stone wall. 47 steps constituted a complete circuit. He walked circuits until his legs ached. Then he halted and performed what he had observed the young men do in the quarters when they aimed to build strength. He lowered himself to the ground and pushed his body up with his arms repeatedly until his muscles quivered. then squats, deep knee bends that caused his thighs to burn. Following that, he would stretch, bending and twisting In darkness, he navigated through movements that prevented his body from completely seizing up. Days merged into weeks and weeks into months. The seasons shifted above him, yet in the cellar everything remained unchanged. Cold, dark, and damp. The only variation was in the food, fresh vegetables during summer and fall, and dried corn and shriveled potatoes in winter. Silas measured time by these changes, his sole calendar in the unending darkness. He ceased speaking altogether after the 3rd month. There was no one to converse with, and he discovered that even talking to himself felt inappropriate, as if words were an unwelcome disturbance in the silence. Instead, he resided within his own mind, replaying memories with vivid clarity. He recalled every horse he had trained, his mother's face despite her passing 17 years ago, Hannah's voice describing Pennsylvania, a place he would never visit, and Ruddledig's face in those final moments before the cellar door shut. The isolation altered Silas's mind, not shattering it, but reshaping it, much like a tree that grows around an obstruction. He cultivated a form of meditation, a mode of existence that required no external input. He could remain motionless for hours, his breathing so slow and shallow that in the darkness he could have been mistaken for lifeless. During these intervals, he was not asleep. He was merely existing, inhabiting a state devoid of thought or emotion, a blank void that mirrored the emptiness surrounding him. However, at other times, when the food arrived, when the bucket was... As Silas's mind cleared, it became exceptionally sharp and focused. He listened intently. The cellar door, made of thick wood, allowed sound to travel. He became adept at recognizing individuals by their footsteps. Rutledge walked with a heavy, deliberate gait. Pwit's boots made a slight scraping sound, favoring his left leg. There was a house servant named Benjamin who moved quickly and nervously, his steps light and rapid. An older woman, the cook, had knees that cracked as she descended the kitchen house steps. Silas committed these sounds to memory. He cataloged them meticulously. He constructed a mental map of the world above him, relying solely on the footsteps and voices that filtered down through the floorboards. He learned the rhythms of the plantation, the early morning rush as people hurried to prepare for the day's work, the quiet of midday, the evening's activity, and the deep night silence, occasionally interrupted by a patrol. He practiced with increasing precision. Initially, his body lost weight, becoming lean and hollow. However, as months turned into years, he adapted to the meager rations and established a routine, allowing his body to reach a new equilibrium. He would never be large, as the food was too scarce for that. Yet the muscle he developed became dense and efficient. His movements in the dark became completely silent. He learned to position his feet with such care that even he could not hear his own footsteps. This was not a supernatural ability. It was the outcome of thousands of hours of practice in total darkness, where any misstep could lead to crashing into stone walls, where silence transformed into a unique form of meditation. His hands acquired remarkable sensitivity. In the absence of light, touch became paramount. He could discern objects by their texture, weight, and temperature. He was familiar with every imperfection in the stone walls and every fissure in the floor. When a rat occasionally ventured into the cellar, Silas could follow it by the faint sounds of its claws on the stone and the soft rustle of its fur against the floor. The rats gained significance. Initially, they had frightened him, their unexpected contact in the darkness causing him to recoil in terror. However, Silas eventually began to perceive them in a different light. They were living beings much like himself. They could traverse freely between the cellar and the world above, a freedom he lacked. And on occasion, when he was quick enough, he could capture them. He did not consume them. The mere thought disgusted him, even during moments of hunger. Instead, he observed them, noting the way their bodies moved and how they navigated the darkness with such assurance. He cradled them gently in his hands, feeling the rapid beating of their hearts and the fragile structure of their bones before releasing them. From the rats, he gleaned insights into anatomy, understanding where bodies exhibited strength and where they were vulnerable. He learned the connection between the neck and the skull, where even a slight amount of pressure could halt breath or fracture bone. This was not a deliberate study, at least not initially. It was merely a means to engage his mind and occupy the endless hours of darkness. Yet as time passed over the years, this knowledge became ingrained in him, instinctive. By the 5th year, Silas had ceased to be entirely human in the traditional sense. not due to a transformation into something supernatural, but rather because he had adjusted to an environment that no human was designed to withstand. He had evolved into a being of darkness and silence. His senses had recalibrated, and his mind had been restructured to prioritize survival in a void. He never lost sight of the reason for his presence there. He never forgot Rutled's visage, and in the darkness, with nothing but time and silence, Silas remained in wait. He did not succumb to rage. He did not fall into despair. He merely waited with the infinite patience of stone for the door to open one last time. Above him, the plantation continued its cyclical patterns. Seasons shifted. Crops were sown and reaped. Enslaved individuals were born, aged, and passed away. The war that everyone anticipated drew nearer with each year that passed. Tensions between the North and South intensified. Politicians in Washington delivered speeches. Newspapers published increasingly heated editorials, and in Culpeper County, the memory of a pale-skinned slave named Silas, who had attempted to flee north, gradually faded. Only Rutledge retained that memory, and he never uttered a word about what was confined in the cellar beneath his kitchen house. The years spanning from 1847 to 1859 brought significant transformation to Virginia. The political tensions that had been simmering for decades reached a critical point. In Culpeper County, the changes were subtle yet persistent. Young men began to express their views more openly regarding states' rights and northern aggression. Militia groups emerged, conducting drills on Sunday afternoons. The price of cotton experienced wild fluctuations. Plantation owners were concerned about their investments, fearing the potential loss of everything should the abolitionists in Washington succeed. Rutledge aged, becoming increasingly isolated. He had always been a reclusive individual, but as he entered his 60s, his solitude became complete. He ceased attending church services. He dined alone. The only individual he communicated with regularly was Pewitt, his overseer, and their discussions were confined to matters of plantation management. The house servants learned to navigate the main house like phantoms, anticipating his needs without prompting, evading his frigid stare, yet every 3 days, someone had to descend to that cellar. The responsibility rotated among the house servants, and it was met with universal dread. Not due to Silas's violent nature, he was never violent, but because of the oppressive silence. The individual would unlock the door, push the food inside, and occasionally in the dimness, they would perceive movement. They would hear breathing, slow and measured. However, Silas never uttered a word. He never approached the door. He never begged or implored. He merely remained in the darkness. That silence was far more horrifying than any amount of screaming could have been. Benjamin, the house servant with quick, anxious steps, once confided to another slave that peering into that cellar felt akin to gazing into a grave where something still lived. This remark circulated through the slave quarters, murmured in the shadows of their own cabins. Parents employed the cellar as a threat to intimidate misbehaving children. Behave or master will confine you down there with the ghost, man. However, the cellar and its occupant were largely overlooked by the white residents of Culpeper County. Rutledge never brought it up. Pewitt, who had witnessed Silas's imprisonment, understood better than to mention it. The few other white men present that day had either passed away or relocated. By 1859, there were perhaps a dozen individuals who recalled that someone was confined beneath the kitchen house, and most of them were enslaved individuals who lacked the means to share the narrative. Then came April of 1859, and everything transformed. John Brown had been executed the previous December following his raid on Harper's Ferry, and Virginia was engulfed in anxiety regarding slave uprisings. Militias patrolled the roads during the night. Any assembly of enslaved individuals was met with distrust. Plantation owners slept with firearms beneath their pillows. On the morning of April 3, 1859, Colonel Thaddeus Rutledge experienced a stroke. He had been seated at breakfast when his right hand suddenly lost all strength. The coffee cup he was holding crashed to the ground. His face drooped on one side. When he attempted to speak, only incoherent sounds came forth. They transported him upstairs to his bedroom. A physician was called from town, a young man named Isaac Brennan, who had only recently established his practice in Culpeper. Brennan assessed Rutledge and provided his diagnosis. The colonel would likely survive, but he was paralyzed on his right side and unable to articulate clearly. He would need constant assistance. Rutledge lingered for 3 weeks. During that period, he could only convey his thoughts through grunts and gestures. His left hand, still operational, would occasionally make frantic motions, pointing and grasping at the air. The servants who were attending to him were unable to comprehend his desires. They provided him with water, adjusted his pillows, and read passages from the Bible, yet whatever Rutledge was attempting to convey remained trapped within his impaired mind. He passed away on April 23rd at 3 a.m. Benjamin was present with him at that moment. Subsequently, Benjamin would recount to others that in his last moments, Rutledge's eyes were wide open, fixed on the ceiling, while his left hand repeatedly made a turning gesture as if trying to unlock a door. The funeral took place 2 days later. Rutledge had no immediate family, only distant cousins residing in Richmond who showed no interest in a struggling tobacco plantation. The estate would need to be resolved, most likely sold. Pewitt continued as the temporary overseer, but it was clear to everyone that the plantation was doomed. The enslaved individuals waited with trepidation to discover their destinies, fully aware that they would likely be sold to settle Rutledge's debts. It was during this time of uncertainty that the cellar was completely overlooked. With Rutledge deceased and the plantation in chaos, the strict routines that had dictated life for decades began to unravel. No one remembered to deliver food to the cellar beneath the kitchen house. The door remained locked, yet the daily feeding simply ceased. For 3 days, Silas went without food, not even a morsel. This was not entirely unprecedented. There had been instances over the years when the feeding schedule had been erratic. But this was different. On the 4th day, Silas started to realize that something had shifted. The noises above him felt incorrect. There was an excess of activity, an abundance of footsteps, and too many voices. Then, for an entire day and night, there was nearly silence. No footsteps, no voices, just an unsettling stillness. What Silas was unaware of was that the majority of the enslaved individuals had been taken to town, arranged in a line to be evaluated by a slave trader who would buy them and transport them south. Only a minimal crew remained at the plantation. Pewitt, 2 field hands, and an elderly cook who was too aged to fetch a significant amount at auction. On the evening of April 28th, 5 days after Rutledge's death, one of the field hands, a young man named Thomas, was assigned the task of inspecting the kitchen house to determine what supplies were left. He was not one of the house servants. He had only been employed at the Rutledge plantation for 8 months, having been purchased from a farm in Louisa County. He had never been informed about the cellar or its contents. Thomas entered the kitchen house as the sun was setting. The building had a deserted atmosphere. The fire in the hearth was cold, and the workspaces were bare. He was searching for anything of value, anything that could be sold or retained. His lamp cast flickering shadows across the walls as he rummaged through cabinets and storage bins. He nearly overlooked the door set into the floor near the back wall, partially concealed behind a shelf unit. The padlock was old and rusted. On a whim, Thomas attempted to open it and was surprised to find that the lock was loose. The mechanism had deteriorated after 12 years of exposure to moisture and neglect. With a decisive pull, the lock released. Thomas lifted the slanted door. A scent wafted up from below. It was not quite decay, but rather something organic and ancient, the aroma of a space that had been shut off from air and light for far too long. He directed his lamp into the opening and called down, "Is anyone there?" Silence was his only response. Thomas paused, contemplating whether to inform Pewitt, yet a sense of curiosity and perhaps a latent rebellious instinct compelled him to descend the stone steps into the abyss. His lamp gradually illuminated the area. Initially, he perceived nothing but vacant stone and shadows. Then he noticed a bucket, a tin plate, and ultimately, in the distant corner, a figure seated with its back against the wall. Thomas elevated the lamp higher, and what he beheld would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The figure was a man, astonishingly emaciated, his skin so pale it appeared to emit a faint glow in the lamplight. White hair cascaded to his shoulders. His eyes were shut, and his breathing was so faint that Thomas initially assumed he might be lifeless. However, those eyes opened, revealing a pale gray hue, nearly devoid of color, and they regarded him with complete clarity and no hint of surprise. "My God," Thomas murmured. "How long have you been here?" The figure remained silent. It did not stir. It merely gazed at Thomas with those dreadful, patient eyes. Thomas retreated toward the steps, suddenly gripped by a fear he could not express. This was not a man. This was once a man before the darkness transformed him into something entirely different. Thomas fled. He abandoned the lamp, left the door ajar, and dashed through the encroaching darkness in search of Puett. Upon finally finding the overseer in the main house, sifting through Rutledge's documents, the words tumbled out in a chaotic rush. "There's someone in the cellar beneath the kitchen. I cannot ascertain how long he has been alive," but Thomas struggled to articulate his thoughts. Something is amiss with him. Puett's expression became very solemn. He set aside the papers he had been examining and gazed at Thomas for an extended moment. "You opened the cellar. The lock was completely rusted. I was unaware. No one informed me. Did he emerge?" "No, he remains there. I doubt he is capable of moving." Puett reacted more swiftly than Thomas anticipated, seizing his shotgun from its resting place against the wall. "Show me." They returned to the kitchen house together, Puett's shotgun at the ready. The cellar door stood ajar. Thomas's forsaken lamp still illuminated the steps, casting a faint glow into the depths below. Puett approached the edge and peered down. The cellar seemed vacant, with a tin plate positioned in the center of the floor. The bucket rested in its corner, yet the figure Thomas had witnessed was absent, as if it had never existed. "Where is he?" Puett demanded. "He was right there in the corner, I swear." A sound emanated from outside, barely perceptible. The soft creak of a floorboard on the kitchen house porch. Puett pivoted toward the door, raising his shotgun. "Come out," he called. "Come out now or I'll shoot." Nothing moved. The evening had deepened into full night, and beyond the kitchen house door, everything was dark. Puett took a step forward, then another. Thomas stayed behind him, his heart hammering. They searched for an hour with more lamps, calling out to the other 2 men on the property to help, but they found nothing. No pale figure, no tracks, nothing to indicate that anyone had left the cellar at all, except that it was undeniably empty. "Maybe he died," Thomas suggested weakly. "Maybe I saw a corpse and it just seemed like he was alive." But there was no body. There was nothing. By midnight, Puett had convinced himself that Thomas had been mistaken, had seen shadows, and imagined a figure in the darkness. They secured the cellar door with a new lock and tried to forget about it. The plantation was being sold anyway. In a few weeks, none of this would be their concern. What they didn't know was that Silas had left the cellar the moment Thomas Hadron up the steps. He had moved with absolute silence up and out into the night, his eyes adjusting rapidly to the darkness that was still brighter than anything he'd experienced in 12 years. He had disappeared into the woods that bordered the plantation, moving between the trees like smoke, his pale skin and white hair making him nearly invisible in the moonlight filtering through the leaves. For the first time in 12 years, Silas was free, and he had a list in his mind written in the darkness over. Thousands of hours were spent by everyone involved in placing him in that cellar, or keeping him there. Starting with Puett, the initial death took place on May 2, 1859, just 4 days after the cellar had been opened. Virgil Puett was discovered in the barn at dawn by the elderly cook who had come to begin her morning tasks. As she crossed the yard, she noticed the barn door ajar, which was unusual since Puett was known for his meticulousness in securing the animals at night. She approached with caution and peered inside. What she witnessed caused her to scream so loudly that it summoned both Thomas and another field hand, a man named Samuel, from opposite ends of the property. Puett was found sitting upright against one of the stall doors, his eyes wide open and his mouth slightly ajar. At first glance, he seemed to be merely resting, but as Thomas moved closer, he noticed the unnatural angle of Puett's head, tilted too far to one side. When Thomas touched the body in an attempt to awaken him, Puett's head lolled loosely, prompting Thomas to recoil with a gasp. The neck was broken, completely severed at the spine. There were no indications of a struggle. The barn remained undisturbed. Puett's shotgun was propped against the wall 5 feet away, with both barrels still loaded. The horses in their stalls were calm. It seemed that someone had approached Puett in the darkness, gotten close enough to touch him, and snapped his neck with a single, precise movement before he could react or cry out. The county sheriff, a heavy-set man named Walter Cunningham, arrived by mid-morning to examine the body. Investigated the 3 individuals remaining on the property, and arrived at the only conclusion that appeared reasonable. Puett had caught a thief off guard, likely an escaped slave or a vagrant who had taken his life to evade capture. The absence of stolen items indicated that the assailant had been interrupted before finishing the robbery. Cunningham arranged for a search party consisting of 15 mounted men with dogs to scour the woods surrounding the plantation. They discovered nothing. No footprints, no campsites, and no signs that anyone had been concealing themselves in the forest. After 2 days, the search was terminated. Pruitt was interred in the Culpeper Cemetery, and the plantation was secured in anticipation of a final sale. Thomas, Samuel, and the cook were relocated to a holding house in town to await auction. The Ruddled property remained vacant, with the house gradually succumbing to dust and silence. For 2 weeks, there were no developments. Life in Culper County continued its usual pace. Then, on May 17th, precisely 12 years after Silas had been confined in the cellar, a farmer named John Keller was discovered deceased in his field. Keller's farm was located 2 miles from the Ruddled plantation. He had played a minor role in local matters, primarily recognized for his vigorous involvement in slave patrols. At the age of 52, he was a widower with 3 adult sons who assisted him on the farm. On the morning of May 17th, his sons went to rouse him and found his bedroom vacant, the bed unmade, and the back door ajar. They located him an hour later, lying face down in the tobacco field. Similar to Pruitt, his neck was broken. Unlike Pruitt, Keller had evidently attempted to defend himself. His hands bore bruises and cuts, and his shirt was torn, yet whatever had caused his death was swift and overwhelmingly powerful. The sheriff estimated that he had died sometime after midnight. This death concerned Cunningham more than Pruitt's. Keller's farm was well protected. The man had been a light sleeper, anxious about theft of his property. For someone to enter his home, entice or force him outside, and kill him without disturbing his 3 sons, who were sleeping in the adjacent room, indicated a level of stealth and premeditation that contradicted the notion of a random vagrant. The sheriff began to search for patterns. 2 deaths, both resulting from broken necks, both men connected to plantation operations. He retrieved the records from Rutledge's estate and observed something that caused him to hesitate. 12 years prior, almost to the day, there had been an incident involving a runaway slave. The slave had been apprehended and confined in a cellar beneath Rutledge's kitchen house. Cunningham rode out to the now deserted plantation. He located the kitchen house with its padlocked cellar door. He forced the lock and descended into the darkness with a lamp. The space was vacant, but the air carried that distinct scent of long-term human occupancy. On one wall, someone had etched marks into the stone. Hundreds of marks arranged in groups of 7. Days counted, years recorded. The sheriff climbed back up into the sunlight, feeling profoundly uneasy. He reviewed Rutledge's records further. Cunningham examined the records meticulously and discovered a notation from 1847. Silas Albino, aged 24, attempted to escape but was apprehended. There were no additional entries regarding Silas, no sale, no death, nothing further. Cunningham began to inquire. The enslaved individuals from the Rutledge plantation had been sold and dispersed across 3 counties. However, he succeeded in locating Benjamin, who was now owned by a merchant in the town. Although Benjamin was hesitant to speak, he ultimately confirmed Cunningham's suspicions in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. Silas had been confined in that cellar for 12 years, sustained only enough to survive. He was never allowed outside. No one had seen him except for the individual who delivered food through the door every 3 days. Cunningham inquired about the time of Rutledge's death. Benjamin replied that no one could recall. Amidst all the chaos, the feeding had simply ceased. Then Thomas discovered the cellar door ajar. He claimed there was someone inside, but when Pruitt investigated, it was vacant. Cunningham pondered how much time elapsed between Thomas opening the door and Pruitt checking. Perhaps an hour. Thomas had rushed to inform Pruitt. It took time to persuade him. Then they returned together. An hour. More than sufficient time for someone to escape and vanish. Cunningham calculated the years. Silas would now be 36 years old. An albino man with white hair and pale skin would stand out, be unforgettable. Yet Cunningham had not received any reports of an individual fitting that description. Naturally, if the man traveled at night, evading roads and remaining in the woods, the sheriff disseminated information to all adjacent counties. He was wanted for questioning. A male Negro, approximately 36 years of age. Residents of the town began relocating to the homes of relatives in search of safety in numbers. Men slept armed with firearms. Patrols were established, yet they uncovered nothing. The killings persisted, systematic and relentless. By July, the death toll had reached 19. The media had taken notice of the situation. Richmond dispatched a special investigator, a former Army officer named Captain Edward Hayes, who possessed experience in tracking guerrillas during the conflicts in Bleeding, Kansas. Hayes established his headquarters in Culpeper and initiated a thorough investigation. He conducted interviews with witnesses, analyzed the pattern of the fatalities, and arrived at a conclusion that he privately communicated to Sheriff Cunningham. Whoever is responsible for these acts exhibits military-level discipline. They are patient. Each murder is meticulously planned, and they are operating with a distinct objective. This is not random violence. It resembles an execution list. "Do you believe this, Silas?" Cunningham inquired. "I suspect it is someone who has been orchestrating this for an extended period." Hayes responded. "Furthermore, I believe we are running out of time to intervene." Hayes's assessment was accurate. The deaths had gained momentum, a rhythm that indicated they were culminating in something significant. The pressing question was, what would transpire when the perpetrator reached the conclusion of their list? Captain Hayes enacted a strategy that was as much about psychological warfare as it was about practical defense. He disseminated notices in the Culpeper Observer and affixed them throughout the county, urging anyone with any ties to the Rutland plantation between 1847 and 1859 to step forward and report to his office for protection. The response was revealing. 47 individuals came forward, their faces ashen with fear, each one believing they could be the next target of the unseen murderer. Hayes arranged them into groups, accommodating them in the town's 3 largest structures: the courthouse, the Methodist church, and the Masonic Hall. Armed guards were stationed at every entrance. No one was permitted to leave after sunset. It was essentially a self-imposed confinement intended to safeguard potential victims, while luring the killer out for 5 nights. Nothing transpired. The town held its breath. Then, on the morning of July 23rd, one of the guards at the Methodist church was discovered dead at his post. His neck was broken, and his body was positioned in his chair in such a manner that from a distance he seemed to be asleep. The killer had passed by him, entered the church, and exited without anyone inside hearing a sound. When Hayes and Cunningham entered the church, they encountered something that sent chills down their spines. Inscribed on the wall in chalk in neat, meticulous letters was a list of names. 19 names were crossed out, indicating the victims who were already deceased. 28 names remained. And at the top of the list, underlined 3 times, was a name that caused Hayes to curse under his breath. "Benjamin Rutland." "Who is that?" Cunningham inquired. Hayes consulted his notes. "Rutled's cousin resides in Richmond. He inherited the plantation after Rutled's death and then sold it immediately. He is the one who authorized the sale of all the enslaved individuals. Therefore, he is not present. He is in Richmond." He had been in Richmond, Hayes noted somberly. "I must send a telegram without delay." The reply arrived 3 hours later. Benjamin Rutland had departed Richmond 2 days prior, en route to Culper to consult with attorneys regarding some outstanding property issues. He was lodging at the Chapman Hotel on Main Street in room 7 on the 2nd floor. Hayes and Cunningham hurried. They rushed into the hotel, ascending the stairs 2 at a time, while the hotel proprietor shouted objections behind them. Hayes forcefully opened the door to room 7 and halted. Benjamin Rutland was seated in a chair by the window, gazing out at the street below. He was a slender man in his early 40s, dressed in a costly suit that hung loosely on his body. He did not turn upon their entrance. He remained completely still. Hayes approached cautiously. "Mr. Rutland?" There was no reply. Hayes extended his hand and touched the man's shoulder, causing Rutled's body to tilt forward and then collapse to the floor with a heavy thud. His neck was broken and his spine was severed so thoroughly that his head was merely attached by skin. The window was ajar. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains. Hayes peered outside and observed the empty alley below, save for shadows. On the windowsill, faintly discernible, were marks in the dust, handprints pale against the dark wood. He ascended the exterior of the building. Hayes remarked softly. "Second-floor brick wall, devoid of handholds." He scaled it effortlessly. This death altered everything. The murderer was not merely traversing the county. Unseen, he possessed the ability to perform physical feats that appeared impossible. Furthermore, he had infiltrated a secured building during daylight hours, ascended an exterior wall, murdered a man in a room on the 2nd floor, and departed without being noticed. The anxiety that had been escalating in Culper County erupted into complete hysteria. Families fled to Richmond, to Charlottesville, or anywhere that seemed more secure than remaining. Businesses ceased operations. The county effectively came to a standstill. Of the 47 individuals who had sought protection from Hayes, 32 completely vacated the town, willing to risk the journey rather than await death's arrival. Hayes recognized that he was losing command of the situation. A change in strategy was necessary. Instead of passively waiting for the killer to act, he needed to pursue. But how does one pursue someone who moves like smoke and strikes like lightning? The solution emerged from an unexpected source. Thomas, the young field hand who had opened the cellar, had been residing in town under Hayes's protection. One evening, while Hayes was examining his notes in the courthouse, Thomas approached him with hesitation. "Sir, I have been contemplating something." Hayes looked up. "What is it?" "When I encountered him in the cellar, he was merely sitting there as still as stone. I do not believe he was taken by surprise when I opened the door. I think he was waiting, as if he knew it would eventually open." "What is your point?" "He is patient, sir. More patient than any individual I have ever encountered." "What if that is his strength?" "He can wait. He can remain still. He can conceal himself in plain sight, because he does not need to relocate." Hayes contemplated this. "You are suggesting that he is in town, concealed somewhere, awaiting his next chance." "I am suggesting that he may be in a location we have already searched. A place we overlooked because we were unaware of how to search." That evening, Hayes arranged a different type of search. Rather than hastily moving through buildings and alleys, his men proceeded slowly and methodically, examining every shadow, every crawl space, and every corner that could hide a motionless human figure. They operated in teams of 4 with lanterns, scouring the vacant buildings scattered throughout the town. They discovered him in the deserted grist mill on the outskirts of town, 3 hours past midnight. He was perched in the rafters, 20 feet above the ground, his pale skin and white hair rendering him nearly invisible against the whitewashed beams. He was not precisely hiding. He was merely sitting, observing, and waiting. When the lantern light illuminated him, his eyes reflected like those of an animal, pale and unblinking. "Silas," Hayes called up, "come down. We need to converse." For a prolonged moment, nothing occurred. Then Silas moved, and even though they anticipated it, even while watching for it, the men scarcely noticed his movement. He simply dropped from the rafter, landing in a crouch that should have shattered his legs from that height, then straightened and faced them. In the lantern light, he appeared less like a man and more like something sculpted from white stone. He was impossibly thin, his skin stretched tightly over muscle and bone. His hair cascaded past his shoulders white, as fresh snow. His eyes were devoid of color, reflecting light without absorbing it. He wore filthy, torn clothing, scavenged from somewhere. He stood completely still, not even appearing to breathe. "Silas," Hayes repeated, "I am Captain Edward Hayes. I am investigating the deaths in this county." Silas did not reply. His gaze shifted from Hayes to the other 3 men, assessing and calculating. Hayes observed that Silas maintained perfect balance, his weight evenly distributed, his hands relaxed to his sides. He appeared at ease, yet Hayes had encountered enough soldiers to identify a fighting stance when he saw one. "I know what happened to you," Hayes continued. "I am aware of the cellar. 12 years. No man should suffer what you have suffered." Still, there was no response. Silas's expression was blank, as unyielding as a sheet of paper. It felt like conversing with a statue. "But you have killed 20 people, 20 men. While some may have warranted your wrath, the law still stands. You comprehend that, do you not? You must answer for your actions." Silas tilted his head slightly. It was the first genuine movement he had made. When he finally spoke, his voice was a hoarse whisper, rough from disuse. "The law." Those 2 words dripped with more disdain than any amount of shouting could express. "Yes," Hayes replied, "the law. I understand it failed you. I recognize that the justice system in Virginia permitted your imprisonment, but 2 wrongs do not create a right. You cannot simply kill everyone who has wronged you." "Why not?" The question was straightforward, unambiguous, and Hayes realized he lacked a satisfactory response. In the ensuing silence, one of the deputies, a young man named Peter, who had been visibly anxious since entering the mill, made an error. He instinctively moved his hand toward his pistol, a subtle motion, likely unconscious. However, Silas noticed it. What transpired next occurred in less than 3 seconds. Silas reacted with a speed that seemed impossible for someone who had been seated just moments earlier. He closed the gap to Peter, 15 feet before anyone could respond. His hand darted out, not to strike, but to press against Peter's throat in a precise manner. Peter's eyes widened, his mouth opened in a silent gasp, and he collapsed. The other two deputies drew their firearms and fired. The gunshots echoed loudly in the confined space of the mill, the muzzle flashes blinding. Yet Silas was no longer in his previous position. He had slipped into the shadows, and amidst the confusion and darkness, he vanished. One moment he was present, the next he had completely disappeared as if he had never been there. They discovered Peter barely alive. Silas had pressed on his carotid artery at a specific point on his neck, causing him to lose consciousness without inflicting any injury. It was a calculated response, not meant to kill, but to serve as a warning. Hayes and his men thoroughly searched the mill. They uncovered a small area in the rafters where Silas had evidently been residing, containing a stash of stolen food, several bottles of water, and a piece of paper with a list of names written in meticulous script. It was the same list that the information had been displayed on the church wall, yet this particular version included annotations next to each name, detailing times, locations, and routines. Silas had been observing his targets for several weeks, studying their behaviors, and biding his time for the ideal moment to act. The pursuit escalated. Hayes enlisted additional men from Richmond, arranging shifts to ensure that patrols monitored the town around the clock. Guards were stationed at every building where potential victims were housed. Checkpoints were established on all routes leading out of Calper. It transformed into a siege, with the entire town serving as a fortress and one pale killer acting as the army attempting to breach the defenses. However, Silas had cultivated patience in the cellar. He had learned to wait, to endure, and to exist without taking action until the opportune moment arose, and he was prepared to wait indefinitely. Days turned into weeks. August arrived, bringing with it oppressive heat. The town remained under lockdown. Some residents began to suspect that Silas had escaped, believing that the heightened security had driven him away. Hayes, however, remained unconvinced. He sensed the tension of waiting, akin to a held breath, like a bowstring drawn tight, ready to release. On August 15th, Hayes received a report that caused his stomach to sink. One of the names on Silas's list, a man named Howard Fleming, who had served as a slave patrol leader in the 1840s, had convinced himself that the threat had subsided. Defying Hayes's explicit orders, Fleming had vacated his secured quarters in the courthouse and returned to his farm, located 6 miles outside of town, accompanied by his 2 adult sons for protection. Hayes immediately set out with 6 armed men. They arrived at Fleming's farm at dusk and discovered the front door ajar. Inside, they encountered Howard Fleming along with his 2 sons. All 3 had met their demise, their necks broken with a chilling precision. The fatalities had transpired within the last hour, as evidenced by the warmth of the bodies. However, what unsettled Hayes the most was a detail he nearly overlooked. On the kitchen table there were 3 tin cups, each containing water, arranged in a tidy row. Beside them lay a plate with 3 pieces of cornbread. This mirrored what Silas had received in the cellar. These were scant provisions, barely sufficient for survival, served on tin. The symbolism was unmistakable. This is what you provided me. Now I return it. As Hayes stood in that kitchen, gazing at the macabre display, he came to a realization that chilled him more than any violence he had witnessed. Silas was not merely killing out of fury or vengeance. He was making statements. He was crafting a narrative. Each death represented a chapter in a story he was narrating, a tale of injustice and retribution, about 12 years taken and repaid in blood. He will not cease. Hayes voiced his thoughts. Even if we eliminate him, even if we apprehend him, the story will persist. People will remember this. One of the deputies interjected. So, what is our course of action? Hayes surveyed the 3 bodies, the cups of water, and the meticulously arranged scene. We must attempt to conclude the story before it devastates this entire county. The breakthrough emerged from an unforeseen source. Benjamin, the former house servant who had cared for Rutland during his final illness. Benjamin had, having resided in town under protection, one evening Benjamin approached Hayes with information he had previously been too afraid to disclose. There is one more location he might visit, Benjamin stated softly. A place that holds more significance than all the others. Where? The cellar? The origin of it all. He will eventually return there. I am certain of it. That location has become a part of him. Hayes pondered this. Why would he go back? There is nothing there. Precisely for that reason, Benjamin asserted. Everything that transpired with him, everything he transformed into, it all began in that cellar. He must conclude it there. It was a fragile theory, relying more on instinct than on proof. However, Hayes was running out of alternatives. The list of names was shrinking, and with each fatality, Silas appeared to grow more audacious, increasingly willing to take risks. If Benjamin's assertion was accurate, if Silas was progressing towards a final act at the site of his confinement, then Hayes had to be prepared. He arranged an ambush. 20 men, the finest marksmen in the county, were strategically positioned around the deserted Ruddled plantation. They arrived at midnight on August 28th, taking their positions in complete silence. Hayes stationed men in the main house, in the barn, and in the trees encircling the kitchen house. The cell door was left as it had been discovered, unlocked, slightly ajar, serving as an invitation. Then they waited. Hours elapsed. The night was warm and still, the air heavy with humidity. Insects chirped in the darkness. An owl hooted from the trees. The men remained motionless, battling fatigue, their fingers resting. Gently on their triggers, the men waited. Dawn was likely an hour away when Hayes heard it. The faintest sound, little more than a whisper of disturbed air. He glanced toward the kitchen house and saw nothing, yet he was certain that someone was present. He raised his hand, signaling the men to maintain their positions. For several minutes, there was no movement, then so gradually that it appeared to be an illusion of the dimming darkness. A pale figure stepped out from the shadows near the kitchen house. Silas traversed the yard with the steady, unhurried gait of someone who possessed all the time in the world. He approached the cellar door, hesitated with his hand on the frame, and then descended the steps into the darkness below. Hayes counted to 30, allowing Silas ample time to fully enter the cellar. Then he signaled. 20 men advanced on the kitchen house from all sides, their weapons raised, their movements as synchronized as any military operation. Hayes reached the cellar door first and called down into the darkness. "Silas, it is over. Come up with your hands visible." Silence was his only reply. Hayes ignited a lantern and descended the steps, his pistol drawn, with 2 deputies following closely behind him. The cellar appeared exactly as it had when Thomas first opened it months earlier, empty, save for the old bucket and tin plate. But Silas was there, seated in the same corner where Thomas had previously seen him, his back against the stone wall, his pale eyes reflecting the light of the lantern. "It ends here," Hayes declared. "One way or another, it ends here." Silas regarded him, and for the first time, Hayes perceived a semblance of emotion in those colorless eyes. It was neither anger nor fear, but something more intricate, perhaps exhaustion or satisfaction. "It ended 12 years ago," Silas stated softly. "This is merely concluding what was initiated. You have taken the lives of 23 individuals. They robbed me of 12 years. 12 years enveloped in darkness. They transformed me into this." He gestured towards himself, indicating his pale skin and white hair, as well as his slender frame that still moved with lethal precision. "And now they are astonished when this is the outcome. The law." "There exists no law," Silas interjected, his tone still subdued, yet edged like shattered glass. "There was no law when they confined me here. There was no law when they fed me scraps akin to a dog. There was no law when they entirely forgot about me, leaving me to perish in the shadows. You wish to discuss law with me now?" After all that, Hayes found himself at a loss for words. The reality was that Silas was correct. The law had utterly and completely failed him. What options does a man possess when the entire system is structured to deny his humanity? "So what happens next?" Hayes inquired. "You eliminate everyone on your list, and then what? You vanish? You continue killing until someone intervenes." "I head north," Silas replied matter-of-factly, "to Pennsylvania, to locate a woman named Hannah who informed me about freedom. That was the strategy 12 years ago. It remains the strategy. Do you genuinely believe you can simply walk away after 23 murders? I believe no one will pursue me for long. I believe the residents of Cape Air County will be eager to let this narrative conclude. Allow me to fade into legend. I believe you will inform them that I died, escaped, or disappeared, and everyone will be relieved to move on from this." Hayes felt a sinking sensation as he recognized that Silas was likely correct. The county yearned for this nightmare to conclude. If Silas vanished, if there were no further fatalities, most individuals would be satisfied to let the enigma remain unresolved.
"I cannot permit you to leave,"
Hayes stated. Yet even he could detect the uncertainty in his voice. You cannot prevent me, Silas replied. He replied, You brought 20 men, perhaps even more, and you believe that is sufficient? He rose, his movements fluid and deliberate. I have spent 12 years contemplating this moment. 12 years devising a plan. Do you genuinely think I entered this cellar without a clear understanding of how to exit? Before Hayes could reply, before anyone could react, Silas acted, but not towards Hayes or the deputies. Instead, he approached the wall, targeting a section of stone that appeared identical to every other part. His hand pressed against it and something shifted. A square section of the wall, approximately 3 feet on each side, pushed inward, unveiling darkness beyond. Silas stated that the plantation was part of the Underground Railroad, pausing at the opening. Rutledge was unaware. His father constructed this tunnel in 1820, linking the cellar to a root cellar in the woods half a mile away. I discovered it after 3 years of exploring these walls in the dark, inch by inch. He glanced back at Hayes. I could have departed at any moment after that, but I chose to wait. I waited until Rutledge was deceased, until everyone who placed me here could comprehend what it meant to be hunted, to experience fear, to be aware that death was imminent and yet be powerless to prevent it. He stepped into the opening, and his pale figure began to dissolve into the darkness. Tell them whatever you wish. Tell them I perished in the cellar. Tell them I escaped. It is inconsequential. The narrative is already established. Hayes raised his pistol, but his hand trembled. He could fire. He could summon his men to chase Silas into that tunnel. However, gazing into Silas's eyes and witnessing the unwavering certainty within them, Hayes realized that any effort would be in vain. This man had endured 12 years in darkness, adapting and evolving into something that transcended typical human boundaries. Not supernatural, but beyond what anyone had deemed feasible. Hayes lowered his firearm. Silas offered a single nod, a gesture that could have signified respect, acknowledgement, or merely a farewell. Then he disappeared, vanishing into the darkness as completely as if he had never existed at all. Captain Edward Hayes submitted his official report on September 3, 1859. The report indicated that Silas, the escaped slave implicated in 23 murders in Culpeper County, had been located at the deserted Rutledge plantation, where he had taken his own life by hanging in the very cellar that had once confined him. Hayes noted that the body had been incinerated in accordance with health regulations, and the ashes had been dispersed. The case was officially deemed closed. No one challenged the report. The residents of Culpeper County wished to believe it was concluded, and Hayes had granted them the license to believe. The bodies were interred. The families grieved. Gradually, with caution, the county began to restore its fractured sense of security. Yet whispers circulated. Naturally, there are always whispers. Some claim to have spotted a pale figure traversing the woods at night, moving north along routes frequented by runaway slaves. Others asserted that in Pennsylvania, in the years following the war, there existed a white-haired man who collaborated with the Underground Railroad, who possessed an extraordinary talent for moving silently and who refrained from discussing his past. A man who, as some claimed, would occasionally remain in utter darkness for hours, completely motionless, as though he were back in that cellar awaiting something. Benjamin, the former house servant, recounted a tale before his passing in 1891. He stated that one night, years after the occurrences in Culpeper, he awoke to discover someone seated at the foot of his bed, a pale figure with white hair and colorless eyes. He recounted that the figure gazed at him for a prolonged moment, then uttered in a whisper, "You fed me. Even when others forgot, you remembered. Thank you." Then the figure vanished, and Benjamin never encountered him again. Thomas, who had opened the cellar door, relocated to Ohio following the war and became a school teacher. He imparted to his students the significance of human dignity and the consequences of a society that neglects to recognize that every individual, irrespective of their skin color, is human. He never referred to Silas by name. However, his students noted that he would occasionally sit in complete silence during lessons, gazing into the distance as if perceiving something invisible to others. The Rutledge plantation was never sold. It remained deserted for decades, gradually succumbing to decay. The cellar door stayed locked, and local children were cautioned against approaching it. Legends flourished around the site, suggesting that one could hear scratching from beneath the earth. that pale figures roamed the ruins at night, and that anyone who ventured into the cellar would emerge irrevocably changed. In 1923, a developer from Richmond, the land was acquired, and all remaining structures, including the kitchen house, were demolished. During the process, when workers broke through the floor to fill in the cellar, they stumbled upon an unexpected find. The bones of 7 rats were meticulously arranged in a circle on the stone floor, and in the center, etched into the stone in barely discernible letters, was a single word: remember. The developer, unsettled by this discovery, instructed that the cellar be immediately filled with concrete. Presently, a shopping center occupies the site. The individuals who park their vehicles and purchase their groceries remain oblivious to what lies beneath the pavement. The tale of Silas has faded into local folklore, one among numerous ghost stories recounted to scare children on dark nights. However, if you visit Calpa County and converse with the old families who have resided there for generations, you will find that some still secure their doors at night. Some still scrutinize the shadows before retiring for the night because they recall the tale their grandparents shared with them about the pale man who spent 12 years in darkness and emerged as something that straddled the line between human and shadow, between man and myth. On certain nights, when the moon is obscured and the air is tranquil, people claim they can sense someone observing from the darkness. Not threatening, not violent, merely watching, waiting, patient as stone. A reminder that some narratives, regardless of how much we wish for them to conclude, never truly do. They simply linger in the darkness, much like Silas did, until someone opens the door and they are released once more. Official documentation indicates that Silas passed away in 1859. However, records are not infallible. In the shadowy realms where history neglects to venture, where the forgotten and the erased continue to murmur their truths, some assert that he remains out there, journeying northward, still in pursuit of the freedom that was promised a dozen years too late. What are your thoughts on Silas's fate? Did he truly perish in that cellar? Or did he manage to escape in search of the freedom he envisioned? Please share your opinions in the comments section below. If this narrative resonated with you, if it prompted reflection on the darkness that humanity can impose upon one another and the resilience required to endure it, please press the like button and subscribe for additional true stories that history attempted to conceal. Share this video with someone who values profound, unsettling narratives about America's obscured history. The forthcoming story may be even more harrowing. Until then, keep in mind that sometimes the most frightening monsters are those we create ourselves.